There is a moment in every man's life when fear stops being a visitor and becomes a ruler. It never announces itself. It arrives quietly, in hesitation, in the breath you hold too long, in the step you convince yourself can wait until tomorrow. Fear isn't loud. It doesn't roar or scream. It whispers. It hides in excuses, in distractions, in the softness of comfort. And slowly, without noticing, a man begins living smaller than the spirit inside him. But the ancient warriors of Japan carried a truth carved from centuries of survival. Fear does not disappear. It is trained into submission, not by courage, not by confidence, but by relentless discipline practiced so consistently that doubt has no place left to root itself. This is the path walked by Ren, a young wanderer who has spent his life avoiding the very trials meant to shape him. He runs from conflict, hides from expectation, and flinches at the thought of failure. Until the day he meets a silent warrior monk deep in the mountains, a man whose presence feels like a mirror reflecting everything Ren has tried to escape. From that moment, Ren begins to learn a lesson older than any sword. Fear is not conquered in battle, but in the quiet rituals a man repeats when no one is watching. If these words awaken something deep within you, remain and walk the path as it unfolds. The boy who ran from his own shadow. Ren's fear began long before he understood its name. As a child, he learned to shrink, not because anyone told him to, but because the world felt too loud, too sharp, too quick for a quiet soul like his. He stayed at the edge of conversations, the corner of gatherings, the farthest line of every game, moving like a faint outline of a boy rather than the boy himself. People called him gentle, soft-spoken, polite, but no one saw how often his hands trembled under the table, or how many words he swallowed before they could escape his mouth. His fear didn't roar. It lingered like a second shadow, always beside him, always slightly ahead, teaching him to step back before he ever stepped forward. Ren's turning point came the day he froze in front of the entire village. A simple task, lifting a wooden beam during a festival, became a moment that branded him. His grip slipped, the beam fell, and the sound echoed louder than the laughter that followed. It wasn't cruelty, it was amusement. But to a boy already fighting the weight of his own silence, it felt like humiliation carved into bone. From that day, people spoke of him differently. The timid one. He means well, but he's not built for much. Ren absorbed every word until they shaped the outline of who he believed he was allowed to be. Fear became familiar, predictable, safer than trying. Yet beneath all that hesitation lived a quiet, restless truth. A truth waiting for the first crack in his self-doubt. The mountain of silent teachers. Ren did not climb the mountain in search of wisdom. He climbed it to escape the feeling that his life was closing in on him. After another public failure, another moment where his voice cracked and his courage vanished, he walked past the village borders and kept walking until the land turned steep and unforgiving. The air thinned. The path narrowed. But something in him insisted he continue, as if an unseen hand were tugging a red thread tied to his chest. Halfway up, he found an abandoned shrine with a locked wooden drawer at its base. The lock was rusted, ancient, stubborn. Ren tried to open it. It didn't move. It felt like a warning, or an invitation. Then he sensed it, the unmistakable presence of someone watching him through the mist. From the fog stepped a warrior monk, robes worn, posture unshaken, eyes carrying the weight of someone who had buried entire versions of himself. He said nothing. He simply walked past Ren and knelt beside the locked drawer. With a single touch, he acknowledged it. Not to open it, but to show Ren that some things are meant to remain sealed until a man is ready. For 2 days, Ren followed him at a distance, studying the rhythm of his life. The monk rose before dawn, trained in silence that felt heavier than war, carried water up steep stone steps, ate slowly with presence sharp enough to cut through noise. Every movement was precise, deliberate, disciplined. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like stone splitting. "Fear isn't your enemy," he said. "Your lack of discipline is." Those words struck Ren harder than any training stick, because he knew they were true. Rituals that break the ego. At dawn, the monk woke Ren with a single strike of a wooden staff against a cracked stone basin, a sound that felt like it split the sky. There were no explanations, no gentle instructions, only a command Ren felt rather than heard. The first ritual was breathwork, deep, sharp inhales, slow, controlled releases. Ren's lungs burned, his mind clawed for escape, and his ego whispered that he wasn't built for this. But the monk watched him with unblinking stillness, offering no comfort, only presence. Then came the stone-carrying walk. Ren was handed a rough boulder marked with a faint red thread carved across its surface. "Do not drop it," the monk said, not because the stone mattered, but because Ren's belief in himself did. Halfway up the trail, Ren's legs shook. His old self begged to stop. The monk didn't intervene. He simply walked beside Ren, silent as snowfall, letting the young man confront the one opponent he had never truly fought, his own mind. Then came the cold water ritual. Ren stepped into a mountain stream so frigid it felt like shards of ice cutting into his skin. Everything in him screamed to run. His breath shortened, his fear surged, loud, wild, unrestrained. But in that chaos, the monk whispered the first true lesson. Fear spikes only when comfort dies. Let it die. Ren stayed, shivering, trembling, refusing to flee. And something shifted. Not a dramatic transformation, but a fracture in the old pattern he had lived in for years. A tiny rebellion against who he once was. By nightfall, Ren's ego was exhausted, but his spirit, for the first time, felt awake. The trial of the moonless night. The monk waited until the sky swallowed its final sliver of light. A night with no moon, no path, no mercy. He handed Ren a single object, a burned wooden ledger, edges blackened as if it once held secrets meant to be erased. "Leave it at the forest's heart," he said. No explanation, no guidance. Ren stepped into the trees. The darkness felt alive, thick, almost breathing. Every branch creak echoed like a childhood memory he had tried to bury. Every gust of wind carried whispers of old shame. The forest became a mirror of his past, the stumbles, the humiliation, the moments that shaped his fear. Halfway in, something moved. A rustle, a presence, not animal, something else. Ren's instinct screamed to run, but he didn't. For the first time in his life, he stayed. Ren closed his eyes and returned to the rituals. One breath, deep enough to steady the shaking in his hands. Another, slow enough to remind his body that panic is only a memory, not a destiny. The presence in the dark crept closer, bending branches, shifting leaves, shaping itself like every shadow he had ever feared. But Ren did not move. The ledger in his hand grew warm, as if the past itself was burning through it. He walked deeper until the forest swallowed him whole. At its center stood a single cracked wooden post, almost like a forgotten grave marker. Ren placed the burned ledger at its base, and the forest fell silent. Then something strange happened. The darkness didn't vanish. It bowed, as if acknowledging that Ren had finally stopped running from himself. Yet before Ren turned to leave, he sensed another truth waiting somewhere deeper in the mountain, something the monk had not yet revealed. The warrior of returning steps, Ren descended the mountain at dawn, the mist curling around his ankles like a final blessing from the unseen teachers who had shaped him. He did not feel fearless. Fear still breathed inside him, but now it followed rather than led. His steps were steady, his breath calm, his presence quiet but heavy, like a blade sheathed yet unmistakably sharp. When he reached the village, people paused, not because he had returned, but because something in him had changed in a way they couldn't name. His shoulders were no longer curved inward. His gaze no longer shifted away. Even his silence felt different. Not the silence of a boy hiding, but the silence of a man choosing when to speak. A child bumped into him and apologized. Ren simply smiled, a small, controlled smile, and placed a gentle hand on the boy's head. It was the first sign that he had become someone new. Ren did not announce his transformation. He woke before sunrise, chopped wood in the cold, ate in silence, worked with a focus that made time feel narrower, cleaner. The same men who once laughed at his failures now found themselves lowering their voices around him, without knowing why. It wasn't power he radiated. It was self-respect. And the human nervous system is wired to recognize that before any title, status, or story. Modern psychology calls it regulated presence, a body no longer hijacked by panic, a mind no longer owned by old shame. One evening, Ren passed the old festival grounds where his hands had once slipped, where the laughter had once cut him open. The wooden beam was gone, but in its place, he noticed something strange near the temple wall. A small, cracked cross of dried red thread, tied there by an unknown hand. Someone else, it seemed, was now living with a fear they hadn't yet faced. And the mountain, somewhere in the distance, felt suddenly not finished with this village.